do the introduction for you and then share at that point. There we go, recording now. Okay, so welcome everybody to our 63rd, 64th Betting Online Sport Economics Seminar. We've been meeting online for almost as long as the pandemic's been in existence, almost every week, sharing sport economics research. And I think this is the first time in that entire 18 months that we've had a presenter from Australia. And so we're delighted that we have Patrick Ferguson, who's taken the hit on his Friday night, staying up, presumably without too much alcohol yet, and it's ready at 11:30 p.m. his time to present to us. So thank you very much, Patrick, for that. Patrick is going to present on consuming contests, outcome uncertainty and spectator demand for contest-based entertainment. And as he's going along, he's more than happy to take questions for clarification. So if you do have them, raise your hand and I will then interrupt Patrick, because he won't be able to see very much whilst he's sharing his screen. Do keep yourselves on mute in the meantime, and there'll be plenty of time at the end for Q&A as well. So without any further delay, Patrick, please do share your screen and take away your talk.
Great, thanks for that, James. Really appreciate being given the opportunity to present the seminar. It's a paper we've worked on for a little while, and we're keen to get some feedback, comments from the sports economics community. So as you said, the paper is called Consuming Contests, Outcome Uncertainty and Spectator Demand for Contest-Based Entertainment, and it's a paper that I've worked on, or have been working on, with Kareem Lakhani, who's at HBS. Kareem's done a lot of work in sort of contests more generally, so he's been a sort of really great resource for me to work on with the paper. So what I'll do is I'll just flag sort of the first few slides. I'll provide an overview of the paper, so we can sort of get all the action out of the way early, so everyone knows sort of what the paper's about and what the key takeaways are, and then I'll jump into some more of the details. What I'll also do is flag where we're keenest to get some comments and feedback on the paper. So we're fairly happy with sort of the empirics, and we think that part of the paper is fairly well developed, but we're really keen to get feedback from the sports economics community, sort of the group, around sort of how we position the paper in the literature, making sure we address all the relevant parts of the literature that we should, making sure we don't miss sort of any of the literature, overlook it. So as you can tell from the title, we've tried to be quite general with how we initially framed the paper, and then narrowing in on sport, and in particular on Australian rules football. And in doing that, we think the paper sort of makes a contribution to a few literatures, but we also don't want to undersell sort of any of the prior work that's been done on this really well-established question. So what I'll do is I'll jump straight in and sort of address, why do we care about game outcome uncertainty? So the focus of the paper is on this idea of outcome uncertainty around the outcome of a game. And this sort of harks back to a really early sort of foundational question in the sports economics literature, and that's around whether or not spectators prefer to attend sports contests that have more uncertain outcomes. And here I sort of bracket the term sort of sports contest, because there's also a broader range of contest-based entertainment that this literature can speak to. So it could be things like game shows, or it could be sort of things like any other sort of contest-based form of entertainment that's consumed by spectators. So not just observing the behaviour of contestants, but also individuals that consume the contest for whatever reason that may be. So as I've highlighted sort of on the right part of the screen here, there's a really strong sort of following around this idea that spectators prefer to attend contests that are more uncertain in practice or in industry. So we have a range of labour market regulations and competitive balance policies that are put in place in professional sports that are all centred around this idea that spectators do in fact prefer to attend or consume contests that are more uncertain. So I've selected a quick quote here from the CEO of the Australian Football League, which is the focus of this study, and I think the quote's worth reading out because it sort of nails this sort of practical side why we care about the question. So what Gillon McLaughlin here was saying a few seasons ago is that we, the AFL, have pursued a managed competition with these policies instead of one left to free market forces, so that every club has the opportunity to be successful on field and to give their members and supporters hope. Having a competition in which there are uncertain outcomes each week, with every club capable of beating the other on any given day or night, is fundamental to driving interest in our game and building attendances, club memberships, and national television and digital media audiences. So that quote really well encapsulates this idea that sports administrators are drawing on this outcome uncertainty hypothesis to design their leagues, to put in place policies that they think make contests at the season level, or even, and particularly at the game level, more uncertain. There's also some sort of tangential or related literatures in economics that tap into this idea of outcome uncertainty. And there's work that's being done, theoretical work that's being done in the literature on information preferences and belief-based utility. And a lot of this work sort of thinks around how people may be drawn to sources of information that create and then resolve suspense and uncertainty. So these theoretical papers look at sports, but they also look at things like, I said earlier, game shows, but other forms of entertainment. So it could be suspenseful films or suspenseful novels. And then sport is just one application or one sort of setting in which they think about these preferences for the resolution of uncertainty. And finally, there's this idea that the contestants have preferences for public recognition and social distinction. So this idea that if uncertain contests draw in greater audiences, this may interact with the preferences and incentives of the contestants. So this idea being, when you're designing a contest, you consider sort of the first order effects in terms of more uncertain contests attracting spectators, but also this idea that may in turn, by creating a larger audience, motivate or incentivize the contestants within that setting. So this taps into a sort of broader literature that's looked at things like innovation contests and challenges, which are drawing on crowds to compete in contests, and the idea that there are audiences for those types of contests, and the idea that contestants are motivated to perform in front of these audiences, and potentially the larger the audience, the harder or sort of more intelligently the contestants will compete. So I've done a really quick job of surveying literature that probably everyone's very familiar with in this setting, but worth flagging sort of where we start off with. And then there's this idea of, well, what does the empirical literature say about the sort of attendance effects of game outcome uncertainty? So there's a few sort of big seminal papers I've highlighted here, and I'll read a few quotes out and then point to a table that provides just a snapshot of the literature. But basically the takeaway, according to Zamansky 2003, is it true that demand for relatively certain matches is weaker than for highly uncertain ones? And perhaps surprisingly, the evidence on this is quite ambiguous. So Jeff and Rob McDonald have a paper that was written in the same year that probably everyone's familiar with, and their takeaway was evidence of an effect of match level uncertainty of outcome on match attendance is relatively weak. And then finally, the Coates, Humphreys and Zhao paper talks about how the predictions of the uncertainty outcome hypothesis are not widely supported in the existing empirical literature. So to communicate that, like I mentioned earlier, I provided a really brief snapshot of just some of the empirical papers that have studied this topic, covering a range of different sports and leagues, covering various different sort of windows of time, using different measures of game outcome uncertainty. And these studies have produced sort of different results. Some sort of support the hypothesis quite tightly, more broadly with some caveats. Others provide evidence that kind of flips either way, suggesting there is a strong positive effect, there's a potentially negative effect, or there's sort of a null result. There's nothing loads in the papers. So this idea here is that the empirical literature on this sort of very central hypothesis in sports economics is fairly mixed and hasn't resolved a great deal over a fairly lengthy time in which it's been studied. So why the mixed findings? And lots of papers that look at this question have raised potential reasons why we may not see a really sort of consistent set of results. The first is a pretty obvious explanation, and it could be that there are differences across sports, markets, and over time. So sort of some examples are, well, maybe consumers in North America and consumers in Europe have different preferences, and the reason why our results flip around a bit is that we're picking up those sort of national differences. There's this idea that potentially across sports, there are just natural differences in the construction of the contest itself, or in the preferences of the individuals that follow that sport. So maybe baseball is fundamentally different to football, which is fundamentally different to rugby or cricket. And then finally, there's this idea that potentially some sports or some time periods have seen a greater focus on individual competitors within these, let's say, their team sports. So this idea that maybe consumers just care about seeing specific individuals competing, so superstars, and their attachment to the outcome of the contest is really only about sort of what it says about the performance of a superstar. Now, the potential issue with this sort of explanation is that it doesn't help us understand why papers that study the same sport within the same setting and potentially the same time frame produce differing results. So those sorts of explanations haven't held up so well when we look at sort of papers that are studying effectively the same setting. Another explanation that's put forward in the literature is that there are differences in measurement and estimation. So sort of the three more commonly seen explanations offered within this sort of broader understanding of the literature is that maybe the varying results, the mixed evidence is a function of different measures of game outcome uncertainty. So some papers typically or historically use standing-based measures. More recent papers have used odds-based measures. Maybe the literature is mixed given these differences in measurement. There's also this idea that attendance can be censored in the sense that some leagues sort of feature high levels of sellouts and other leagues aren't constrained by that sort of limited supply issue. So potentially there could be some skewy things going on with how we deal with these sort of censored outcome variables coming from a limited supply of seating or a limited supply of sort of in terms of excess demand. And then finally, there's some questions around how different functional form assumptions in the actual modeling can drive the mixed results in literature. And this ties on to sort of underlying theoretical frameworks that are being sort of operationalized by these sort of functional form assumptions in the empirical models. So this gets at the idea that there could be sort of reference dependent preferences and loss aversion all interacting with outcome uncertainty, and what we're getting is results that are sort of picking up sort of these different things, and it's being driven by the underlying sort of theory that's motivating the particular use of certain functional forms in the empirical models. So the tact that we take in our paper is the focus on this idea that there could be biases introduced in the estimates in the literature from the endogeneity of game outcome uncertainty. So what we sort of do in the paper is we think through the ways in which the sort of standard modeling approaches in the empirical papers, so selection on observables and fixed effects, empirical designs, how they address sort of ways in which game outcome uncertainty may be endogenous. So there's ideas around whether it can both drive attendance and can also affect game outcome uncertainty. In some settings that's observable, others it's not. There's this idea that potentially leagues or teams may, in the short term or in the immediate lead up to games, pursue different promotional activities or marketing activities or advertising activities that are contingent on sort of the upcoming uncertainty of the contest. So they may try to promote a game that's expected to be a bit of a blowout, with the idea being that will drive up attendance. And the issue is if these things are unobserved, it's going to bias our estimates of the effect of outcome uncertainty on attendance. And finally, there's other moving parts here too. So the idea that could be sort of prices on the primary and secondary market may be moving around in response to expectations about the uncertainty of an upcoming game, and this will also affect demand and observed attendance. And there's also issues that can potentially arise around which particular players take the field, in the sense that some teams may rest star players or manage star players or certain athletes in the lead up to games that are expected to not be particularly close, and that may also have an effect on attendance through a direct channel, not just through game outcome uncertainty. So in the paper, we spend quite a bit of time thinking through the ways in which these different stories may bias estimates of the effect of game outcome uncertainty on attendance, and whether or not sort of the use of fixed effects and throwing in controls are able to address these sources of endogeneity. So with that in mind, we then sort of think about, well, what do we do in our paper? So to identify the effect of game outcome uncertainty on stadium attendance, we examine game level data for all regular season games played in the Australian Football League between 2013 and 2018. So our choice to focus on the Australian Football League was driven by somewhat familiarity with the setting from my end, not so much from Kareem's end, given he's based in the US and not super familiar with the sport, at least initially. So familiarity from my end with the sport, and also an interest to see what is a really large, heavily followed sporting contest in Australia receive some more attention in literature. It's relatively under-examined. Jeff Bourne's done a bit of work on AFL, so is Liam Lenton, but we felt that it's a good setting in which to think through some of these endogeneity concerns, and also a good setting to focus on, given it has been somewhat under-examined. So what we do in terms of the method in our paper is that we use injury-induced lineup changes to instrument for game outcome uncertainty. So we do two things. And firstly, what we do is we show that these injury-induced lineup changes are strongly correlated with changes in a game's expected outcome. So what we do is we establish that we have a relevant instrument in that sense. Then what we go and to lengths to show is that these injury-induced lineup changes appear to be orthogonal to a range of observable covariates and sources of unobservable common error. So we try to show that our injury-induced lineup changes are plausibly exogenous, and thus meet the exclusion restriction, meaning they serve as a valid instrument for game outcome uncertainty, with the idea being that meeting those criteria, they allow us to identify the causal effect of game outcome uncertainty on stadium attendance. So with that empirical strategy in place, what do we find? What we find is that a 1 standard deviation increase in game outcome uncertainty causes, on average, at least an 11.2% increase in attendance. We then go and show how that relates to estimates that we arrive at using OLS and sort of traditional fixed effects approaches. And what we see is that the OLS estimates in our setting are downward biased. So we see that they're about half the size, or potentially sort of a third of the size of our two-stage least squares estimates. So we identify this as evidence consistent with endogeneity of game outcome uncertainty being a concern in our setting, and potentially masking the strength of spectators' preferences for uncertain games. We then go on and perform a battery of robustness checks and tests to show or try to rebut ways in which our empirical strategy may be flawed. So we think about issues that may arise with superstar injuries, and we go and show that our instrument doesn't seem to be violated by these sort of superstar effects. We also think through things like endogenous injury-induced lineup changes. So the idea being that teams of varying quality may choose to rest players under the guise of injury, and how that may violate the exclusion restriction of our empirical strategy. And then we also exploit some alternative instruments, or particularly an alternative instrument, which is league-enforced suspension as another type of plausibly exogenous lineup change that affects game outcome uncertainty and, by extension, attendance. So on this little figure that I've produced here, which is sort of in some ways informative, what I've shown here is basically our OLS estimates, sort of the mean estimate, and our max and min OLS estimate, and our max and min and mean two-stage least squares estimate, to convey the idea that there's this sort of downward bias in our setting on the OLS estimates, driven by the endogeneity of game outcome uncertainty. And in the paper, we propose sort of a few potential explanations for that. So I'll discuss those a little more at length as we move through the paper, but I thought here's a great opportunity to sort of survey what we've found, so I don't get to the end of the paper and sort of leave everyone waiting for some results and run out of time. I've at least gotten to the bang before I get into the nitty-gritty. Were there any questions anyone wanted answered before I jump into sort of the details of the setting and then into the details of the empirical strategy, or are we good to continue?
Rob's got a question for you, Patrick.
Great, yeah, fire away.
Thanks, Patrick. Maybe you'll cover this, but why is the bias in OLS downwards? If you've got an omitted variables problem, wouldn't it go the other way? Your OLS estimates would be upward bias. Isn't that what normally happens with IV?
Well, I mean, the bias can go could go either way. That's my understanding of it. I mean, I'll talk through the specific stories we have for that in the empirical section. Okay. But that would be my sense. We can chat through again, if that doesn't answer your question. But I'll get into. I've got 2 or 3 slides where I talk through the bias in particular, and hopefully that resolves sort of how we're trying to present it in our study, at least. So I'll provide some background on the Australian Football League. So I assume people aren't terribly familiar with it, but the Australian Football League is the country's most popular sports competition. So it's by far the most heavily followed sports league in the country. Playing numbers are very large, but it's the most well-attended sports competition. It's the most heavily viewed sports competition. Which then begs the question, what do they play in the Australian Football League? And it's Australian rules football, which is a game unique to Australia, which I'm sure most of you have seen some footage of, which I'll provide a really quick overview. Basically, it's a ball sport. You play on a cricket field, so an oval. The ball's moved by foot from end to end, and the objective of the game is to kick the ball through a set of posts, upright posts. There's tackling, there's lots of jumping and catching of the ball. The sort of main takeaways are that players cover a lot of ground, so it's very taxing in terms of aerobically, and also there's lots of high-speed contact, and the players don't wear any padding. So what we emphasise that for is that injuries are common. Injuries arise from wear and tear of running, and injuries arise in contact, and we make arguments that those injuries are plausibly exogenous. In the sense of kind of what's at stake in these contests, it's well attended. So sort of typical games have 30 to 35,000 spectators. The bigger teams in Melbourne will attract sort of 50 to 60,000 on average, and then games between the largest teams will attract sort of 90 to 100,000 spectators. So it's a well attended sport, similar to club football in Europe, but less supply constrained. So they're playing out of really large stadiums, so it's very unusual during the home and away season to get sellouts. There may be maybe one game in the home and away season approaches sellout, but normally there's sort of excess supply. So we're not bumping into sort of any sort of censoring of the outcome in that regard. Competitive balance policies are well and truly in place in Australian rules football. So there's a draft, there's a hard salary cap, there's revenue sharing, free agency restrictions. So in many ways, it looks kind of like a North American sports league in that sense. So we're seeing a fairly even competition in that regard. So not a bad setting to think about outcome uncertainty and potentially what that may say about competitive balance policies. And then the final point is that legal betting on individual games is very widespread. So it's legal in Australia to bet on the outcome of individual games, and betting activities very, very active. We have a liquid market in that sense for betting on the outcome of individual games. So similar to the UK, quite different to something like the US. So teams announced their lineup of 22 players several days prior to the upcoming game. So normally sort of 2 days before they'll name the 22 players that will appear in that upcoming game. So large team sport, 18 players for each team are on the field at any one time. So 36 players on the field at once. What the teams do is they explicitly identify ins and outs, and the outs distinguish between omissions and injuries. So outs are players that appeared for the team in the previous game but won't be appearing in the upcoming game. So omissions are players that are dropped for reasons of form or not selected, and then injuries will be identified by the type of injury. So you'll see players listed as sort of ACL or like a head knock or concussion or whatever the injury may be. That will be reported in the lineup change. So what we mean by lineup changes, as I stated earlier, players who appeared for the team in game T-1, but due to injury were not selected for game T. Now, I spoke a little earlier around how game outcome uncertainty is likely to be endogenous. And what we're talking about here is sort of beware of unobserved confounders. So I raised some of these points earlier, but the idea could be that teams or the league may, at the start of the season, expect certain games to be not particularly close or maybe particularly close, and then pursue certain promotions or advertisements to potentially increase attendance at games they expect to be close, or maybe increase attendance at games they expect to not be terribly close. So the idea being that these promotion and advertisements may be endogenous to the expected game outcome uncertainty, and that's also going to operate on attendance. So the idea being, so for instance, if it's upward bias, there could be this concern that the league expects a game to be very close. They think it's going to be well attended. They want the game to be very well attended. They may put some sort of promotion in place where they offer, who knows, a range of prizes. They offer potential to meet players, whatever that may be. There could be a range of sort of ways in which they're incentivizing attendance for those games. We can also think through how weather may be a confounder in this setting. So the idea being that all these games are played out in the open. There's no roof. So one concern may be that wet weather may increase the uncertainty of an upcoming game, the outcome of an upcoming game, and wet weather may also keep away spectators who don't want to sit out in the rain. So the concern there would be that would potentially downward bias regular OLS estimates. You can, weather is observable. So lots of studies do in fact try to control for it. Whether that's the observed weather, does that do a good job of addressing sort of people's expectations about the weather is always sort of a point of discussion. That being that they make their sort of attendance decision largely on what they expect the weather to be, not what the observed weather was. We can also think through some other potential confounds. So we have the sort of scheduling of games by the league and how that may interact with rival events or substitute events. So the league may schedule particular games in more or less appealing time slots that may not clash or will clash with a rival sport that's being played. And that could be a function also of the expected outcome uncertainty of the upcoming game. And finally, there may be some action sort of going on with ticket prices. So in the Australian Football League, there's no sort of legal secondary market. There's a small market for secondary market for tickets. They have to be sold through the league platform and have to be sold at face value. But prices are set at the start of the season, and they do vary from game to game. In the sense when they're set at the start of the season, some games will be more expensive than others, and those pricing decisions aren't observed. And one concern may be that the league could vary prices with the expected uncertainty of a game during the season, which may also then affect attendance through that channel. So these are nothing sort of, these stories are not sort of super specific to the AFL, but there are ways in which there could be things moving around that aren't getting picked up by or aren't being addressed by your team fixed effects, your season fixed effects, your sort of week of the season fixed effects. You may not be able to observe these things also moving from game to game. So those traditional approaches may not address them. It's not obvious how they do necessarily. So how do we measure? I've been talking about game outcome uncertainty for a fair while here. How do we sort of measure the construct? Well, the primary measure we use is is the betting odds implied win probability to construct a measure that's based on the Thiel's inequality index. So we're following a fairly well used measure in the literature. It's constructed as per sort of the papers I list there, at least consistent with the Schreier paper. We also use some alternative measures of game outcome uncertainty. So we use the line or the spread, the point handicap. We don't report the results, but we run robustness checks using that measure. We also look at things like the differences in the expected win probabilities of the teams, the ratios of the win probabilities, and the results we end up arriving at are largely consistent with those that we report in the paper using the Thiel inequality index measure. In terms of how we measure attendance, it's sort of as it says on the label. So attendance IJS is the number of spectators in attendance at the game between home team I and away team J in season S. So IJS sort of uniquely identifies each game within the season. Nothing too out of the ordinary in regards to that measure. So what are our injury shock measures? What are our injury-induced lineup change measures? So we use two in the paper. We use the number of injuries in game IJS, which is the number of injury-induced lineup changes made by the non-favourite for the game between home team I and away team J in season S. So it's just a count of the number of outs due to injury for the non-favourite team. I'll discuss why we focus on the non-favourite team in just a couple of slides' time. But that's the first measure we use is our injury instrument. And the second is rating of injuries, IJS, which is the number of player rating points lost by the non-favourite due to the injury-induced lineup changes for the game between home team I and away team J in season S. So this player rating points is a summary measure of a player's sort of performance over the duration of the previous season is how we construct it. So we average their game ratings using this AFL measure, and then we take that as a measure of the quality of those players that are lost to injury. It's not perfect in the sense that no one measure captures everything, but if you wanted to think about sort of how that AFL player rating measure works, it's somewhat similar to sort of a WAR measure or an adjusted plus minus. So it's trying to get at what's this player's overall contribution to their team's performance. So our second injury measure or instrument is using this player ratings, sort of sum of player ratings lost to injury. And then the first is just a count of the injury-induced lineup changes. I'll provide a quick overview of the summary statistics. So we see how sort of the data behaves, but basically what we have is, like I said earlier, your average game's getting around sort of 30,000 spectators, a bit over that, and we're seeing quite a lot of variation in that. So we have some games where there's under 5,000 spectators, which is they'll be happening up in New South Wales where they typically follow rugby more than Australian rules football. And then we have games in Melbourne where you're seeing sort of mid 90,000 spectators coming to a game. What we observe is with our outcome uncertainty measure, by construction, it ranges from 0 to 0.7. That's how the sort of measure works. And what we're observing is the sort of the mean game outcome uncertainty is around 0.54. So quite high, which reflects the fact that the Australian Football League is a pretty even competition. So we see teams regularly sort of churning over the ladder from season to season, and there's I think in the last maybe 20 years we've seen something like 12 or 13 teams win the title. So there is a fairly sort of flat competition in that regard, which feeds into on average being sort of fairly even games during the season. Now, how do our injury measures work? So what we see is that the average game has around sort of 1.23 injury-induced lineup changes to the non-favourite. So we're seeing that injuries are fairly common, so that they're happening in most games. I think sort of we see that there are injuries in about what we see there, about 770 of our just over 1,100 games are affected by injury lineup changes, and teams have a range of sort of injuries in terms of sort of the number that may affect them. So we see games where they're getting 1.2 on average, up to 10 or 11 injury-induced lineup changes, which suggests kind of carnage in that sense. So they're churning over almost half their team, which makes you feel a little nervous for their welfare. But it can be a pretty tough sport. They've sort of played 22 games in the regular season, so they're getting banged around a fair bit in that regard. And then we just to sort of speak through one final portion of these summary statistics, we have the ratings of the injured players, and what we observe is, just to calibrate everyone in the units of how these ratings measures are constructed, your average player has a rating of about sort of 65 on this AFL player rating. So we're seeing the average injured player is sort of just above your average player in the league, in the sense. So what we're seeing is that we're seeing that these injuries are in some sense a performance shock, in that they're seeing a marginally above average player being pulled out of the lineup, and the expectation is that they're being replaced by a marginal player that's likely weaker than the starting player that is now injured. We produce some evidence to sort of support that, but that's how the units of this AFL rating works. Were there any questions about any of the measures or the data before I jump into sort of some of the tables and some of the figures?
Yeah, we've got Stefan. Patrick.
Oh, yeah, sure. Fire away.
Hey, Patrick. Sorry, I just want to clarify it says the probability of a favourite win is 0.73. Does that mean 73% probability that the favourite wins?
Oh, so what it's saying, sorry, is in your average game, the favourite is a 73% chance to win.
So that's pretty extreme, right? I mean, so I'm sort of struggling. I mean, as you said several times, the AFL is very balanced, but 73% probability for the favourite to win. That's an extraordinarily high rating. That's what, 4-1, something like that. Isn't that 3-1? That's amazing, isn't it? Am I just getting this wrong?
It's fairly high.
I mean, normally you say for soccer, right? I mean,
yeah.
Rob might say, but I mean, isn't it, probability of favourite winning is, we think of it 0.5, 0.6 as being fairly high, 0.7 as being a runaway favourite. I don't know, when Manchester City plays Burnley, what's the probability?
There's also no draws here, really, in effect, no draws. So that's going to, so it'll be, there was 73, and then it will be sort of a 30-ish% chance of the non-favourite. So there's no, so we're not observing any, basically draws can happen, but they're very uncommon. So it's not like a draw is sucking up any of the probability of an outcome here.
Okay, well, I just wanted to clarify that that's what it meant, but so please, sorry, carry on.
No, sure. No, that's good. That's helpful. No. Were there any other questions around the data?
There's no other hands up, Patrick. So
All good.
you're good to proceed.
Great. So, given I've spent this time banging on about endogeneity and whether or not these instruments are valid, what I'll do now is talk through sort of what that actually implies. So, for injury-induced lineup changes to be valid, they must meet a few conditions, sort of two central conditions, and then sort of one slightly more technical condition. So the first is that these injury-induced lineup changes must be relevant. So what this means is that injuries must impact the expected outcome of the upcoming game. So what I mean by this is that they should basically act as shocks to the relative strengths of the competing teams. So what this entails in terms of sort of the story is that less experienced or lower quality players are being selected in as replacements for starting players that are no longer able to appear. So the idea being that we have sort of marginal players that aren't selected when the 22 are fit. When an injury occurs, these sort of marginal players are brought into the side, but they are of a lower quality than a starting player. So that story sort of doesn't make sense, and we produce some evidence to show that at least the betting odds behave in a way consistent with that. So in the sense that the market seems to have that reaction to a lineup change. So what the monotonicity requirement requires is that we only use the non-favourites injury-induced lineup changes in our identification strategy. So why we do this is that injuries to the non-favourite strictly work to lower the uncertainty of the upcoming game, the outcome of the upcoming game. So they act as a negative shock. So if the non-favourite loses player to injury and replaces them with a weaker player, that's going to make that team even more of a non-favourite, which will decrease the uncertainty of the upcoming outcome of the upcoming game even further. Concern with using injuries to the favourite is that they may violate this sort of monotonicity. So if you have a marginal favourite that suffers, let's say, several injuries to very good players leading into a game, that may see the favourite become the non-favourite by a larger measure than they were the favourite, which will work to decrease the uncertainty of the upcoming contest, which is a problem because if you had a very strong favourite that suffered an injury, that would make them a slightly less favourite, but still the favourite. So what that would then serve to do is increase the uncertainty of the outcome of the upcoming contest. So we can think through how injuries to the favourite don't meet this monotonicity requirement, whereas for the non-favourite they do, because they strictly work to decrease game outcome uncertainty, which is not the case for the favourite. Finally, it's a good point to raise here, and one we sort of try to think through a bit in the paper, but it's worth talking about because sometimes it doesn't always come up with sort of IB papers. What's going on in terms of heterogeneity? So what we mean by this is, well, who are the compliers in this empirical strategy? Who is the injury-induced lineup change acting on? Whose behaviour is it relevant for? So it's marginal attendees, and how we define those is sort of a bit up for discussion. But what we mean by this is individuals that are sort of deciding to go or not to go to a game based on the sorts of changes that in game outcome uncertainty that would arise from injury-induced lineup changes. So you can imagine season ticket holders that have a reserve seat that are strong diehards. They sort of incur these large upfront costs to buy season tickets. They're probably very committed. Their behaviour is unlikely to be nudged or impacted by these changes in game outcome uncertainty that are driven by injury-induced lineup changes. So we're not really, our estimates are unlikely to be describing terribly much about the attendance behaviour of these sort of never takers in this setup. So what we're really identifying is the behaviour of these sort of marginal attendees, these compliers, those for whom the injury is relevant. That's whose behaviour is being described here. The second condition in our identification strategy, that's second condition that's required to be met by instrument, is the exclusion restriction, and this is that injuries only affect attendance through changes in game outcome uncertainty. So this is obviously something that can't be directly tested. We can't test this. So what we need to do is we need to make sort of an argument based on our understanding of the setting, and then present some supporting evidence that's consistent with this story, that hopefully moves people's priors closer to the idea that these injuries are plausibly exogenous. So firstly, we make the argument that lots of the injuries in our setting arise due to sort of random on-field events that arise in game T-1. So these are head knocks, joint injuries, things that arise in tackles, in slipping over, muscle strains that occur in game T-1 that are affecting the lineup that's fielded in game T. And this is during the regular home and away season, when the league is scheduling sort of games not based on playing a weak opposition followed by a strong opposition followed by a weak opposition. There's no sort of pattern like that. So what we're arguing here is that these injuries are basically arising due to sort of fairly random events on the field, and that they're also not just occurring in sort of, they may be occurring in tight contests or closely contested games in T-1, but what we care about is how they affect expected game outcome uncertainty in game T. So we're making this argument that is sort of consistent with them being plausibly exogenous. And finally, in our design, we allow for specific teams to be better or worse at managing injuries. So what our concern may be is that well-resourced teams may have very impressive sports science divisions. Those teams may be better at managing injuries, and those teams, in being wealthier, may also be the teams that have historically been more successful and thus typically more heavily followed or better followed. So there's a concern there that not all teams may be equally equipped at sort of dealing with injuries and may be followed more or less strongly. So what we do is, in our sort of two-stage design, we throw in home and away team fixed effects to basically identify off within team variation that arises from injury-induced lineup changes. So we're holding the teams constant and arguing that sort of their resources, at least in the sort of small time frame, relatively small time frame of our study, are fairly sticky. So we're not sort of picking up, or we're not having to worry so much about that as a potential threat to our exclusion restriction. Just to speak to this, the sort of first stage in our study, what we show is that injury-induced lineup changes to the non-favourite decrease game outcome uncertainty. So in table 5 of the paper, we have sort of game outcome uncertainty as a dependent variable, and then we show that both our injury instruments load strongly and negatively on game outcome uncertainty. And these units are in sort of the Steele index, which is not the most intuitive sort of thing to think about in the abstract, but basically these are equal to about sort of a fifth of a standard deviation. So one injury to the non-favourite lowers game outcome uncertainty by about a fifth of a standard deviation. So we have these pretty strong, fairly strongish clean effects that show up in our first stage. So that sort of speaks to the relevance of these injury-induced lineup changes as an instrument. Then we try to present some evidence to show that these injury-induced lineup changes are plausibly exogenous. So we do a few things in the paper, but I'll sort of talk through just a really straightforward test that we present, which is we sort of partition our sample by high injury-induced lineup change games and low injury-induced lineup change games. And this is just above and below median numbers of lineup changes due to injury. And then we look at a few attributes of the games. And what we see is that games with high numbers of injury-induced lineup changes versus games with low numbers of injury-induced lineup changes tend to occur sort of at no different stage during the season. Different time slots during the week don't really seem to load or show up. The strength of the competing teams, as measured by sort of ELO ratings, but also measured by sort of the probability of the team winning, don't seem to show up. So we're not seeing that these injuries are arising at different stages of the season or at different time slots when the turnaround between games may be shorter, which could also be a reason why injuries may be occurring, and don't tend to show up in advance of playing stronger or weaker teams, which would be consistent with sort of injury-induced changes being endogenous if teams are resting players on the sly under the guise of injury. So we have some evidence here that suggests that these injuries are arising somewhat at random during the season. Finally, at the end of the paper, we present some falsification tests, and what we do with these tests is basically we look at injuries at T and then T+1, T+2, T+3, T+4, T+5, and then we look at whether or not basically they load on the attribute of the game at T. So do they load on do they load on outcome uncertainty at game T? Do they load on attendance at game T with these future injuries? And the concern here may be that if there's some sort of unobservable attribute of the teams, we may see some sort of relationship between future injuries and the current attributes of the games in which those teams are competing, but we don't. We seem to just see them loading neatly for the game in which we would expect that effect to show up. So we present that as sort of a falsification test, which we argue provides sort of further evidence that these injuries are arising exogenously during the season. So that's some further evidence on the validity of these injury-induced lineup changes as an instrument. And then we we take a step back and we say, well, great, we've shown that they behave nicely. What do we do with them? So we follow the regular two-stage least squares setup, where we have sort of our first stage, which is basically regressing our instrument on outcome uncertainty, throwing in some covariates, home team, away team, fixed effects, sort of a season fixed effect. We also, in some robustness checks, use time slot fixed effects, all those sorts of things. And then we, in the second stage, basically regress log attendance on our fitted outcome uncertainty measure from the first stage. So it's pretty much your bog standard two-stage least squares design with our injury measures as our instrument. So the results we get here are what I presented earlier in the paper. At the front, I presented that little set of slides. Sorry, that little figure that showed you sort of the OLS and then the two-stage least squares estimates. But basically, we have log attendance as a dependent variable, and then we have our OLS estimate with all our fixed effects thrown in, and then we have our estimates with our two instruments, two different sort of instrument measures being used with all our fixed effects thrown in. And what we observe when we use our OLS design is, so this is sort of interpreting, it's a little bit not immediately readable off the table given we're using log attendance, but what this is saying is that OLS estimates suggest that a 1 standard deviation increase in game outcome uncertainty is associated with an increase in game attendance of approximately 5.4%, so around sort of 2,000 spectators per game. So that's a sort of 5.4% increase in attendance. Now, if we use our instrumented two-stage least squares estimates, we see they're considerably larger, and what they sort of report here as being is around sort of 11 to 12% increase in attendance using these two-stage least squares estimates. So we're seeing that they're sort of about twice as large. We discuss in the paper a range of other fixed effects we could throw in, and we don't really see the results varying a great deal. But what we're sort of the main takeaway is that the two-stage least squares estimates are considerably larger than the OLS ones, as I sort of promised at the start. And the takeaway here is that using our design, we see that spectators strongly prefer contests that have these uncertain outcomes, at least as observed in their attendance behaviour. A little further on in the paper, we then employ a fairly standard modelling approach in the literature, which is not just to sort of regress game outcome uncertainty, so regress attendance on game outcome uncertainty, but we also regress attendance on home team win probability, and then the sort of the square of home team win probability, and we try to fit this this sort of curve, which tells us where's the optimal home team win probability in terms of outcome uncertainty and attendance. So with our OLS design, we see that it's around sort of 0.62, 63%. Sorry, 62 or 63%, which is sort of not inconsistent with some estimates in the literature. And then using our two-stage least squares estimate, we see that actually it's closer to around 52 to 53%, what we're observing when we come up with a sort of estimate of the optimal home team win probability. So that's consistent with the idea that spectators have a stronger preference for games with uncertain outcomes. So that aligns with the sort of the prior table I just showed. Here we're using not the Thiel index, but we're using sort of home team win probability and home team win probability squared, and then backing out these inflection points, so to speak. So that's another result consistent with these spectators' preferences. Finally, what we also do is a bunch of empirical tests to evaluate the robustness of our main results. So we control for the form quality of the contestants in a game. So we in our two-stage least squares designs, we throw in the ELO ratings of the competing teams and see if that makes our results disappear. We don't observe anything like that. We throw in controls for the team rivalries. So a concern may be that teams with particularly heated rivalries may have games that are better attended, and may also see teams potentially be less likely, let's say, to rest a marginal player under the guise of injury. Finally, we also try to address one concern, which is injuries may also affect attendance through the level of scoring in a game. Essentially, if a team suffers injuries, the team may play, let's say, more conservatively in an upcoming game, which individuals may not have a strong preference to see. They may not want to see sort of these very defensive games where a team's being conservative to sort of minimize losses. So what we do is in our design, we throw in control for expectations around the level of scoring in a game, which we have some market-based measures of that in the study. So we have total scoring, kind of the over/under for the total scoring in a game, and we throw that in, and we see that our results again don't change drastically. We then sort of look at this idea that games involving, to jump back a slide, I'll sort of one concern with Australian rules football, which I probably should have brought up a little earlier, is it's played nationally, but historically its roots are in Melbourne, in Victoria. So Melbourne has 9 teams in the competition. So a concern is that we're seeing games where a team is nominally the away team, but they're actually playing still at their home stadium. They're just playing it against a home team that happens to share that stadium with them. So one issue may be that we may observe games that are better attended, that are also now the outcome is more uncertain. And that may not be because any individual has a preference for a more uncertain contest. It could just be that what we're picking up is away team spectators that are wishing to attend now because their team is, let's say, a better chance of winning. A more likely chance of winning. So that's a potential issue, because what it suggests is that these spectators don't have preferences for uncertain contests. We may be picking up the preferences of the non-home team supporters. So what we do to get around this, or try to present some evidence that this is not necessarily an issue with our results, is we only look at, for a subset of our tests, games that involve interstate teams that are travelling to play the home team. And our argument here is that they're sort of bringing with them very few supporters. So Australian cities are pretty far apart, and there will be a really small cohort of people that will attend diehards will attend away games, but for the most part, you don't have a huge amount of travel for away games. You'll tend to just get home team supporters showing up for the home team when an interstate team is playing. So we see our results really actually don't change all that much when we look at this subset of games, which suggests that's not kind of driving our results, that story. What we also do is we exploit the fact that we can observe the types of injuries that the players suffer, and we say, let's just focus on the most likely to be random injuries in some sense. So injuries that are not going to be used or sort of less likely to be misreported. So there's a concern that you'll see some players miss a game due to soreness, or they're unwell, or it might be quite vague and they're out for a week or so and then they're back in. And what we do is we drop those and we just look at what we're calling sort of acute injuries, and that's injuries, like I mentioned earlier, things like ACL injuries, sort of quite severe head trauma, things that are seeing players out for many games, unlikely to be misreported by the teams. And using these acute injuries, our results, again, aren't moving around a great deal. They're pretty much bang on what we get in our main table results. So it doesn't seem like there's this sort of misreporting of injuries or this endogenous injury-induced lineup changes through that channel. There's two other things we do, which I think are kind of key. What we also look at is only exploiting injuries to what we classify as non-star players. So one concern is that, as I touched on earlier, injuries to stars are going to affect attendance through game outcome uncertainty if it sort of makes a game more or less uncertain. But there's also the chance that they'll directly affect attendance, these injuries to stars, because fans have a preference for to see star players, regardless of sort of game outcome uncertainty. It's probably not quite as a bigger concern as a sport, let's say like basketball, where there's relatively few players on the court and there's clearly big superstar effects associated with dominant individuals in these fairly small team sports. So in Australian rules football, there's 18 players on the field. So these sort of star players tend to be not as big draw cards, but it still is a potential concern. So what we do is we control for these stars to injury play. Sorry, we control for these injuries to stars, and in a sense, what we're then doing is only exploiting injuries to the non-star players, and then seeing, do our effects hold up using sort of injuries to these good but not great starting players. And what we find is, again, our results don't change a great deal. So how we define stars is we use that earlier AFL player rating that I mentioned, and we define stars as players in the top 10%, sort of in the 90th percentile, players in 95th, or players in the 99th, and using those sort of quite generous and then quite a bit stricter definitions, we don't find our results flipping, changing a great deal. So that doesn't entirely kill off that story, but it's evident, consistent with it not driving our results. And then just sort of talk through one final robustness check we do. What we exploit are league enforced lineup changes. What I mean by this is effectively suspensions. So I've put a picture here of two players fighting. It's common for players to be fairly common for players to be suspended. So the league regularly bans players for wrestling, striking, head-high contact. So we have some variation in the lineups of teams driven by players being suspended due to on-field discretion. When we use these league-enforced lineup changes, our results are largely consistent with those that we produce using our injury-induced lineup changes. So we present that as a final check, consistent with our instruments being well-behaved for our empirical strategy. So I didn't want to throw thousands and thousands of tables with those robustness checks into the presentation. I thought it'd be worth sort of presenting them verbally at the end. And what I'll do is I'll sort of quickly summarize the main takeaways from the paper. And what that is that using variation in game outcome uncertainty caused by injury-induced lineup changes, we show that contest outcome uncertainty has a large positive causal effect on stadium attendance in the AFL. So overall, our estimates of the effect of game outcome uncertainty on attendance are significantly larger than prior estimates in the literature, or definitely larger than the OLS estimates that we present. And in the paper, we talk through sort of what some prior estimates are. We also then say that sort of addressing endogeneity and emitted variables concerns is extremely important for understanding the impact of outcome uncertainty on demand for contest-based forms of entertainment. So that's nothing really new. I'm sure everyone here has an acute sort of sense that this is an important thing to be tackling. So we're not sort of kicking down any doors in making that statement, but just sort of reasserting the primary motivation for the exercise we pursue in the paper. And then finally, I think it's worth stressing that our empirical strategy is well suited to application in other settings. So future research can exploit injury-induced lineup changes to identify the strength of spectators' preferences for uncertainty in a range of sports contests. So there's going to be lots of people listening in that know a lot more about a lot of other sporting settings. And I'd be keen to hear about how they may think that sort of injury-induced lineup changes may be used in those settings. There could be some sports where it's less suitable and some where it may be particularly well suited. Sort of as revealed by the paper we've written, we felt that the AFL was a good setting within which to think about injuries. We feel there's others where that's also true, and we'd be sort of thrilled to see people sort of adopt and pick up and potentially use this identification strategy in those settings going forward. So I'm more than happy now to take follow-up for the questions. I hope that was not too quick and dense. So anyone?
It was fantastic. Thanks very much, Patrick. Really interesting talk. We've got a couple of questions in the comments, and then I'll go to people who've raised their hands. First question in the comment, I'm not totally sure I'll represent Jorge's point, but he asks, why don't injuries affect attendance directly? Can it be that if the star or best players get injured, maybe potential attendants decide not to go?
Yeah, so that's a great point, and that motivates quite a few of those robustness checks we did do. So the concern was, there's stories you can build up to say that may be the case. So we spoke through those superstar effects that we try to show aren't driving our results. We also show the results that arise when we control for expectations around the level of scoring in a game. We show that that's not likely to be violating the results we present. There are some other stories you could probably present. We're more than happy to try to kill off specific stories. I think those two were the ones that jumped out to us immediately. You could probably build some story around some idea of what team quality or performance quality may be, and the injuries is affecting that. But we tried to tackle the sort of at least those two that were the ones that grabbed us first, and the ones that were we've presented the paper to the league, and they were the two things that they sort of wanted us to think through. But we're more than sort of happy to build in further robustness checks to kill off those alternative stories as well.
Great, thanks, Patrick. And then Sarah asks a general question: would on average the motives of attending be different from away and home fans? Going to away games is more costly, and so these fans will be more committed to going to games.
So the away fans, it's more cost. That may well be the case. So what we think we're picking up and speaking to is the behaviour of marginal home fans. We're not speaking so much to the behaviour of these away fans, and we also think the away fans that are likely to show up, particularly when we're exploiting these interstate games, are these sorts of diehard fans that we don't think our estimated tells us a lot about. These aren't the compliers in our instrumental variable sort of setup. So if you put it on like your Josh Angrist hat, we don't think we're describing the behavior of those individuals with our design, which is absolutely a limitation of what we're doing, but we can't, it's just a feature of the design we've pursued. And I think we need to maybe do an even better job of being clear of that, is we're probably not describing those individuals' behavior, which is not to say that's not interesting and not an important thing. And there are other papers that try to get to that. So maybe papers that do use data on season ticket holders, or papers that use study designs that maybe directly try to measure the behavior of those people. Our study I don't think does a good job of telling us about how those people behave, which is a bit of I guess a cop out, but yeah, we try to tightly just describe the behavior of this subset of compliers, I guess would be the takeaway.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I'm going to hand over to Ian Gregory Smith now.
Oh, hi, Patrick. You've already answered my question partially with your answer to Jorge's question. It was about the direct impact on demand.
Great. Yep.
But so I was wondering whether, because you said you did the STARS robustness check. I wonder if you just do you have those results? Because you're saying it kind of makes a little difference, but not too much.
Yeah, I don't in the current slides. I got the estimates. I think I got it written up. It didn't.
Is it like really close to what you originally got, or is it?
Oh yeah. They're like it's like 10%, I think, versus like the 11 and 11.5 in our main results. It didn't drastically change the size. It was still sort of twice the size of our LOS ones.
Because so I have data on injuries of various sporting settings, and that's been kind of the main reason why I've chosen not to do this research. Because I've always been worried about that direct impact.
And that's definitely that's a great point, and that's one that we were initially cautious with, and also I felt like AFL is suited to it in some sense because, like I mentioned earlier, it's this sort of 18 players on the field on either side, 36 players on the ground at once. It's a sport that I guess fairly superstars in the AFL, I guess, are different to superstars, let's say in football or in basketball, in some sense. So I think maybe that is a story for why it isn't killing our results, whereas it could in other settings, and also a reason why we haven't seen the design employed yet.
Yeah.
That would...
So, and then the other thing was just going back to Rob's first point about the difference between the OLS and the IV results, and I was wondering whether that direct channel, if it is, even if it's just a small part of it, maybe that helps sort of reconcile the size of those differences, because they are very, very different. It is quite surprising that so much difference comes through the IV, and because you'd have to say, well, that's all down to the endogeneity that we weren't controlling for before, and that's quite. I think that's quite a tough sell. Whereas if you have this kind of other direct route, which kind of brings them a little bit closer together, maybe that's a little bit more convincing. I don't know. Yeah.
So it brings it down to around nine as opposed to, let's say, 11.5. So it's still. Maybe that doesn't help me in the sense that it doesn't hurt them enough. I definitely I appreciate your point that in other settings you could see that being a bigger concern, but we didn't find it necessarily killing our results.
Okay,
great.
Thanks,
Ian. Any more questions and comments? Rob.
Myself. Thanks, Patrick. Really interesting stuff. I'm not entirely sure about your literature review at the beginning and your reading of it. I thought for European football leagues and North American sports, the relationship between probability of home win and attendance was U-shaped. So quite the opposite of what you find. The wrong way around.
No, sorry. That's having definitely don't know the literature as well as you and almost I'm guaranteeing most people in the crowd. No, my sense is also in showing that I should have said this when I read that little table through, and showing the negative result. That was also saying like almost the inverse of what you would expect given the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis. This idea that you're getting this upside down U, which how we explain that. I've always found that that story ties myself in a knot trying to understand what's going on with those measures, and I don't speak to that. Like with our OLS estimates, we observed the upside down U in at least the AFL, so I didn't have to get into trying to explain why we observe an upside down U. But that's a good point. I didn't explain that clearly enough in that lit review summary part.
So, I mean, really, my question is quite general. Why is AFL different then compared to North American sports and European football leagues in generating these results?
No, this is like an interesting question around. You think about we observe we're seeing a sports league where competitive balance policies are they're very high powered. And the question is, is that arising endogenously because there's like what is there some set of preferences for that in Australia? I don't know. I don't want to talk about great Australian traditions of equality or whatever that may be. I don't know if they exist anymore. That's a great point. And maybe I don't think we spend enough time in the current draft trying to reconcile that. What we mostly spend our time doing is talking to the OLS estimates that we have in our setting and the two-stage least squares. But I think there's a step missing, which is tying it then back to that pre-existing literature in other sports and saying, why would that not be? Why would we be observing these things in the AFL and not the others? And it's likely not all attributable to just not addressing endogeneity. Like that's clearly not the full story. I think part of the paper as it's currently written, and that's my fault, is in the grasp with the econometrics and thinking through these endogeneity issues, and then there's still a missing link, which is how does that work with the institutional details of this specific setting and tying that back to other sports? And I think that's a point well taken. Like there's probably some work that Kareem and I need to do there, trying to pull that back and then offer some explanations. But great point, and something I've just jotted down that we definitely need to work with.
Okay, thanks for that, Rob. So I just realised that the background noise I was hearing was on my own computer. Sorry for the random interruption there. We've got another question from Stefan.
Yeah, it is a really interesting paper, Patrick. So it's fascinating stuff, and as they often say, important if true, right? So I mean, there's a lot at stake in this literature, and that's one of the reasons why you might, why you're probably going to get a lot of pushback in terms of the way you present these results, because it's for once this is not just a boring academic debate amongst old men about what matters and what doesn't matter in statistics. This argument is used by leagues over and again to justify what many of us view as anti-competitive restraints in order to increase their profitability and increase their control of the labour market, increase their monopoly power. So if you're going to go with this, and this is the way you want to say, there are many of us who are going to want to find loopholes in this because we're concerned about what the implications are if you're really going to say this. So that's so people say, we're not political, right? Like the Olympics are not political, right? Well, there's politics in this as well. So just to stress that's why you might get some pushback.
No, yeah, absolutely. I think, and you partly sign up for that, like in the way we motivate it in the paper. We do sort of position it that way, and I think that's absolutely correct. Like, if we're going to sell it as these spectators have preferences for these things, that's all part of this debate. And we tried to be cautious around saying, like, what does this mean for the debate? And I think we maybe in the conclusion say something like these results may inform that debate around sort of trading off consumer welfare exactly. That's a bit of a cop out.
Patrick, let me tell you, the lawyers for the leagues in the next antitrust case will not be cautious in presenting these results.
No, that's a good point.
It's all very well for us to try and say that, but our work gets used in court, and so you want to anyway. But anyway, in that spirit of questioning, anyway. I still want to come back to this point about the home team, the favourite win probability. Yep. So I just looked at, for the Premier League for last season, what the probability, the share of probability of the favourite relative to the non-favourite, leaving out the draw probability. Okay, so you said, well, it could be the draw as well. So I left that out. And for the Premier League, which we don't think of being terribly balanced, it was 70%.
Yep.
So your probability of the favourite winning is 73%. So I still come back to, this seems absolutely extraordinary. So and that leads me to sort of an interpretation of what you're finding is, what you're looking at are games that are incredibly unbalanced.
Yeah.
way beyond the sort of the you know, if you look at Rob and other people in this literature, they come out with an optimal win probability for the home team of an attendance maximizing win probability of 60 to 65%. So you're looking at games that are way beyond that threshold.
No, but sorry to jump in. Our optimal level was not saying the 0.7. Ours was saying that around 0.52.
No, I know, but what you're saying, but I'm thinking about your sample.
Oh, what we're identifying off.
You're on average, the games you're looking at are incredibly biased for the favorite. And then what you find with your estimates, when you do your econometric estimates on your very, very biased sample, you then find that making it a little bit more balanced from a very, very unbalanced competition on average makes things better. Or increases attendance. Well, that seems to be perfectly consistent with Rob's kind of, even if you, without going into the hump, it makes it at that stage where it becomes very imbalanced, then at that point you actually want some more balance, and that's what Rob and others have been saying for years. And I think that seems empirically right. So, in some ways, aren't your results because of the skew of your sample and because of the way you've selected the sample? Aren't you actually finding something that is not surprising and is not really about having highly balanced games? It's actually making very unbalanced games a little bit more balanced.
Right. I mean, this is just the universe of AFL games for that period. There's no sense that we're only looking at some subset of those games. This just is the nature of that league in that sense.
But you're only looking at the games, but you're only looking at the effect of injuries on teams that are the underdogs, right?
Yeah, but that's still that's all games are still in the are still being used in fitting the model. We're just identifying off.
Right. So any effect of injuries on favourites is not included in your results. So your results are restricted to the effect on underdogs.
Not included in those main results, but in the in fitting that optimal curve, that's every game. That's just injuries to the home and away team. We're not using the non-favourite.
Right. But aren't your estimates based? Isn't that curve based on your estimates, which are derived from a setting where you're only looking at the underdogs?
No, not that second set of results.
Okay, I'm completely lost now because you made it very clear that for your monotonicity argument, you can only look at games where injuries are the underdog, right?
Sure. Yeah, for that table, that's exactly that's what we're identifying.
So that's where, and isn't that where your estimates derive from?
They're coming from I don't have it. They're coming from. It
says at the top, right? Spectators strongly prefer contests that have.
Yeah. So that's
you're using those estimates from this.
That's for in the statement we're saying this 11% increase in attendance. That's coming from this. But what we get
that's my point. Okay, but so that's where my point is. So that from there, if we were to make inferences about the games, we're talking about inferences based on a highly unbalanced set of games where the favourite is strong with a runaway favourite, and you're saying attendance will increase if the runaway favourite is a little bit less of a runaway favourite, which sounds right to me, but also consistent with the literature.
Sure. Okay.
Does that make sense? Am I getting that? I mean, tell me if I'm getting that wrong, though, because I think it's an incredibly important point, right?
No, I mean, I would have to think around it a little more, but I mean, it's definitely that is an explanation. No, it's a point well received. I mean, I'm gonna have to think that through a little more, but I kind of appreciate what you're saying.
Well, and it doesn't just seem to be. Okay, there's also a question of what strategy. If you want to sell this paper to, you want to sell this paper as a really a revolutionary paper that overturns the existing literature, which is well documented, then that's sort of the story you were going with at the beginning. But and I understand why you want to do that, because we all want to publish the best papers we can, and a revolutionary story sells much better than just saying. The alternative is to say, actually, what we find is completely consistent with the results. But I think you could still do that and still say, but this is still a better way of estimating it, because this instrumental variable approach is no one's really done this properly before.
That's a fair,
that I think is still makes a great paper.
That's a fair point, and I think that's still this idea that you still need to reconcile the OLS and the two-stage least squares within this league. That's a fair point.
Exactly. You haven't lost any of the real econometric value of your paper by putting it more within the context of the existing.
No, I can appreciate that. No, absolutely. That's helpful to think through, definitely, in terms of how we're framing this.
It is a very interesting paper. It's really good. I really like it.
No, I really appreciate it. And I mean, there's been some great comments, and this is something that, I mean, it's not an outsider, but I mean, I'm fairly junior in this regard. So this is a great audience to present this in, because I mean, I've presented it in other settings where all people want to do is talk about, let's say, quite technical features of the estimates or whatever that may be. But in terms of actually saying, like, what does this speak to in this really well-established literature, this is the best setting for that, and this is what it's been sort of most helpful for. Brilliant. Were there any other points I can hopefully try to address?
Any more questions, comments? Well, I guess we'll take that as a no, unless something comes in at the very last moment. So thank you very much, Patrick, for staying up well beyond midnight to present your results. And thank you to everyone for questions, comments, participation. We now take a break, a bit of a summer break, and we will return in 2 weeks' time when we have Kai Fischer from the Heinrich Heine University in Düsseldorf, presenting on thinning out spectators. Did football matches contribute to the second COVID-19 wave in Germany? So I'll wish you a good weekend, rest of your day, and look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
So, Patrick, what are people saying